everyone. Thank you for joining us again today. I am Katie Batesman, the Content Director at She Can Code, and today I have the former Forrester analyst, Cory Munchbach, who is the Chief Operating Officer at custom data platform BlueConic. Now, we know the tech industry has some incredible female tech talent, so today we're going to be discussing the tech gender gap and how to close it for good. Welcome, Cory.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Good, thank you so much for joining us. And we would love to kick off with a little bit about yourself, your background and how you got into the tech sector.
Yeah, you bet. For starters, it was totally by accident, which is, I think, a little bit the story of my whole professional life to date. Has been a series of informed but not necessarily planned decisions, and tech is very much one of those. So I studied political science at university and had grand intentions of eventually going back and getting my PhD in public policy. I wanted to teach potentially, and that was like the North Star for me for a long time. And when I graduated, it was in the heyday of the 2008, 2009, hiring and recession and all of that. And so I went to work at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in their research organization. And then Forrester Research, which is a technology and marketing consulting research strategy firm. I had an opportunity to go work there in the sort of what they at the time called the CMO and marketing leadership practice. Still felt like that was good research skills and things that would get me back into PhD land at some point. And then honestly, kind of one thing led to another. I had spent time in that practice and very much focused on this intersection of marketing and technology in particular, and ended up pursuing that more and more in my research career within Forrester. I became an analyst covering that space. And then when I got the opportunity to go work for my now current company, which has been almost 8 years ago, which is all about marketing technology in this intersection, that's how I made the jump from research to software, and now have been doing software for the last 8 years in a number of different roles. So a lot of this, it sort of makes sense when laid out in retrospect. But if you'd asked me when I got started, if this is where I expected to be, the answer would have been an emphatic no.
It's always interesting as well to hear when ladies say, I fell into the tech sector. I hear that so often, and I'm myself exactly the same. I always knew I wanted to be a journalist, but the first publication that took me on happened to be a technology publication, and I stayed in tech because once I got into the sector, I realized actually, all of the different industries that you work with and just what you can, the opportunities available in tech. But it's always, I hear that so often, I fell into tech, and I'd love to hear a lady say to me, yes, when I was younger, I studied for technology because I knew I wanted to be in tech.
Well, I think there's a real relationship, honestly, between the fact that tech, when you sort of think about it, especially initially, was engineering, right? There's sort of synonymous with each other. And I actually now I do a class at Boston College, which is my alma mater, but they added this group called the Shea Center for Entrepreneurship. And my kind of reason for going back and teaching some of these classes and working with their executive director is to stress that tech jobs are so much more than engineering. There is so much to be done. And of course, it's all digital and it's influence and whatnot, but leadership and marketing and sales and customer success, right? There's all of these other things that are part of a technology organization. And so if you look really far back, right, it was sort of engineering is so clearly male dominated, and hasn't changed. But in fact, the fact of tech being more than engineering means that there are so many more roles that aren't as male coded as engineering is, which has meant that I think for a lot of us women, we sort of fell into it because we didn't sort of realize how much wider that aperture could be professionally. And I do think that is very much changing, looking at women coming up, also more women going into engineering. So both sides of that equation, but it doesn't surprise me. I feel like I hear it as well all the time.
Yeah. And you just saying there about how the industry has changed. I wanted to ask you that on, how you think the industry has changed for women since you started, because even what you just mentioned there, I think seeing more women in a full range of roles available in tech, that has absolutely opened up the tech industry for women to join, which thankfully numbers are picking up, but not quite at the speed that we had hoped. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you've hit on it, and there's a lot of great data. The latest Lean In McKinsey study about women in tech and women in the workplace more generally just came out recently. So you can absolutely see how things are improving, at least in terms of what we can quantify. I think the flip side of that is just very recently the way that women in work writ large have had to leave the workplace either because of caregiver responsibilities, challenges at work. So it's certainly not a rosy picture right now, I don't think. And we need to be hyper aware of that. But it is certainly better now than it was 10 years ago. And 10 years ago was better than it was 10 years before that. Honestly, I think outside of kind of the data that we've seen and representation and women in these roles, one of the things that I think anecdotally at least starts to feel like it's a real sea change is also that the women who are in tech are much more focused on making sure that the ladder didn't come up after them, and making sure that by virtue of just their presence being in the room isn't enough, that actually it needs to be a lot more women, more underrepresented people in general. And that to me feels like a really important shift, that the folks who have already made it into the room are not just thinking about themselves necessarily, and all kinds of reasons why they had to do that and all of that. But this sort of fallacy that there's only room for one woman at the top, I do think we're seeing that start to erode, and a lot of really healthy change coming from that. And to me, that's a really critical piece of opening this up more generally, more sustainably, more successfully, will come from that focus for the women who are already there, making sure that they aren't sort of the first and onlys or the first and lasts. And that is starting to be impactful in really meaningful, measurable ways.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Because I think years ago, when the topic, it was just starting to be spoken about, I don't think at the time we didn't really have the evidence to show as well the value of that, and having diversity in a business and what it can bring, and having a minimum of one lady in leadership and the value that can bring. So nowadays we're really starting to have that evidence and that data to be able to prove that. Are there any valuable lessons that you have learned during your early career that you would like to share?
Yeah, I tried, when I was thinking about this and trying to make sure I had something that was maybe a little bit unexpected or sort of unconventional. I don't know that this is necessarily true, but a couple of things. One is being useful. And I think there's a little bit of a tendency with sort of the girl boss feminist version to assert yourself and assert your worth and sort of take all the names right out of the gate. And honestly, I think there's obviously always value in that. You need to value yourself, but being useful opened a lot of doors to me, right? Like in my very early days, just being able to take good notes in meetings, and then I got to be in the meetings and I learned a lot from being in those meetings. And I didn't think it diminished my value. At the time, I had nothing to say. I didn't know anything. And so it was fine for me to be quietly in the room. It was basically like being in a college lecture, and sort of learning that way. I think that also sort of related to figuring out how you can proactively help and find opportunities to have an impact, whether it's for your boss or for other teams, and really seeking out problems and bringing solutions. Again, I think early career, where you're not looked to solve all the problems or to sort of be the one driving, where can you surface that and bring your ideas and make that an easy yes from your boss to take that sort of thing on. So those kind of being useful generally, that changes dramatically. You shouldn't still be the one taking notes, 10 years into your career when you are the expert by any stretch of the imagination. But when you're early and learning is the important thing, and observation, being useful gets you into more places to have the opportunity to sort of burnish those skills. So that's one. asking questions, this does not change early career to late career. The nature of the questions might change. I find not only that 9 times out of 10, somebody else had that question as well, right? That fear that we have of being the only one or who's not keeping up is just a fallacy. I know it feels that way. I still have that, but more often than not, by a wide margin, somebody else had that question and it's clarifying for other people. And even if they didn't, no one's upset or judging you because you asked it again, right? The consequences of not asking are so much bigger than the consequences of asking. And so really helping to do that. And I think also, again, as you get further in your career, that's a mantle you have to take up. I will ask questions sometimes that I do know the answer to, but I can read the room that others don't, and they don't want to speak up. So take that on yourself to ask the question. Right? It doesn't matter to me anymore, but that is a huge opportunity to sort of make sure everyone comes along. And then the last thing I would say is early on is expressing your ambition. You don't necessarily need to know exactly where you need to end up. You don't need to demand that you get there in 6 months or anything like that necessarily. But it's good for people around you to know that you're ambitious and that you have visions of what you'd like and that you want new opportunities, and just making that clear. And don't take for granted that it's obvious to everyone that you have certain ambitions. So those are my 3: be useful, asking questions, and expressing your ambition. I think are the most valuable things that have paid off for me in the biggest ways from my early career to now.
Yeah, that's actually great advice. I think a lot of people can relate to that as well, because especially with the asking questions, and I think we've all had that feeling where most workplaces say, don't they, no question is a stupid question, and make sure that you ask. But sometimes I think we've all had that experience where you ask a question and somebody shoots you a bit of a look that looks like, well, that's a stupid question. And that stays with you and it kind of shuts you down as you go into the next workplace. And you think, well, I really can't ask that, or I can't just clarify a point that I really need to know. And I think it's so important, as you say, just to, put that aside and think, what the consequences of me not asking that stupid question, I just need to get over it and continue being curious and just do it.
Absolutely.
So you have met obviously lots of talented women in tech. Do you have any role models?
Yeah, I do. And it's funny, the questions one is a perfect segue into one of them. There's a woman named Molly Graham who kind of came to fame. She wrote this amazing essay a number of years ago in the first round review called Giving Away Your Legos. And when I happened upon it many years ago now, I had one of those just revelatory moments when you read something and it's so accurately described what being at a growing, scaling startup was like that I've never gotten over it. And she now writes a Substack newsletter where she puts these things out there, and it's both a combination of how intuitive she is about the experience of working in tech and sort of having different lenses on that, and very practical advice as well, and then so effectively communicated. And so I just very much look up to her. And we actually had the opportunity to have her come speak to the company a couple of months ago. It was kind of a dream come true fangirl moment for me with Molly. As you mentioned, right, I'm the president and COO of the company. So Allison Pickens, who used to be the COO at Gainsight, which is a big customer success software platform, and then Claire Hughes Johnson, who used to be the COO at Stripe during some of their biggest scale up phases, are 2 women in the industry, both COOs at big tech companies who just have done some pretty remarkable work. And again, are so thoughtful about the experience and what it means, and practical about advice to give. So those are the 3 that I really look up to, that are sort of, I don't know, you call them like the superstars of a fairly small pool, I guess, in the sense that maybe not a lot of people know them, but I really rely on what they've written and where they've spoken to give me some good guidance. So those are the 3 that I would probably pick as my constant go-tos when I need a gut check or see if they've said something that I'm going through, because they probably have, and they've probably navigated it really well, and I can learn from that.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. And mentioning there, obviously there are great role models in the industry that we can pick out and look to for own personal reasons. But obviously that's quite easy for us. We work in tech and we know that these ladies are available, but why do you think there are still so few women in the tech sector? Is it something about it that's turning ladies off? And, you know, those of us that work in the industry, we wish they just knew how great it could be and how many opportunities are available for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like a really like structural question, I guess. I think I spent a lot of time sort of thinking about this. And I think part of it is that in a lot of ways, certainly up until the last few months, where tech is having quite the reckoning in terms of their performance and all of this, but it's been kind of the industry most equated with power in the 21st century, right? And power historically is a very clear function of wealth and gender in ways that are very structural, right? Going back way, way far. And so if you look at tech, the early access that, you know, largely goes to a particular archetype, money, obviously networks. If you look at venture capital investments, right, largely coming from Harvard and Stanford, basically exclusively, right? You have sort of these very insular sources of wealth and power tied to technology that have then resulted, as I mentioned earlier, right, the coding of engineering being sort of a male field. That's a really strong combination. And if any deviation from that sort of archetype of like a white, straight, cisgendered guy makes it harder to have access to those benefits of wealth and access, et cetera. And so I think it just takes a lot more and a lot longer for people who are not that archetype to get into tech, and also notably to stay in tech, because it's not a space that was crafted from the beginning to be particularly inclusive of people of different traits and different types, et cetera. And so I think part of the reason that there are still so few women is just where this all began and how it's grown up, and that dismantling a lot of this stuff just takes time. We've seen it in other industries, but tech has been that paragon of wealth and power for the last 20 plus 30 years. And that just isn't well suited to just opening up its doors to a lot other people. And I think that's where I think we still see just the disproportionate lack of representation. And that's what it's due to, and sort of the ongoing forces there.
Yeah, and retaining staff as well is, you know, is something extra, isn't it? If we actually get people into the tech industry, how do we ensure that they have an experience where they feel like they want to stay instead of, you know, leaving for something else? So yes, obviously it's a tall order, but where do we think that fault lies with the gender gap? Do we think that's a government issue, an individual issue, or is it something that, you know, each company should be tackling, or is it a collective effort really that needs to move forward?
I mean, I think it's the last one. I will say that one of the most important books I've ever read is a book by a Cornell philosopher named Kate Manne, and it's called Down Girl: The Logic of Misogyny. And it is a very academic book. It is a hard book to read, both in substance and in how I am not a Cornell philosopher, so it takes some work to get through. But what was so powerful about it was that it gave me a framework for kind of understanding these structural forces that dictate how women exist in the world generally, right? Not just work, not just technology. And that has been a really critical lens for me to help understand kind of what we're up against and how a particular system creates and maintains inequality. And in cases, inequality is a gentle way to put it, right? There's all kinds of actual abuse and harassment, right? And all of these other much more damaging things. But if we just sort of bucket it there, that is up to everyone, right? The government cannot just dismantle misogyny in the same way that one single company cannot do that, nor can we as individuals be expected to do any of this single-handedly. So for me, it is a much more kind of collective issue that needs to be addressed over time. It has to get attention and intention, right? This cannot just be passive. I think we're seeing that particularly here in the US, right? Of what we've taken for granted as far as the women's accomplishments, women's progress, women's success. In basically the last couple of months, never mind couple of years, we've seen so much of that rolled back. Again, women opting out of the workforce, reproductive rights, all these kind of things that affect us as professionals and as human beings. I will say, though, given that disclaimer of it being a collective thing that we need to tackle, companies play a very critical part in making this change happen, whether that's through policies that we implement individually, laws that we do or do not support. So companies are not closed ecosystems, nor are they, I don't think, morally able to just sort of opt out of this discussion. And so I do take that part very seriously, while also recognizing very much the limitations of it, both as an individual, as an employee, as an employer, and we're all part of this, but no one benefits from the way we've sort of set this up. That is my ultimate conviction, but I think therefore it's a much broader set of responsibilities that we need to work together toward, and it's going to take it's already taken a long time, and it's going to take a lot more time to really get to a place of what I would say is much closer to an equitable, fair kind of society around this writ large, and then certainly within the tech industry, particularly.
Yeah. And so what type of things do you think can be done to, try and close that gap, that tech gender gap forever? Is that kind of, goals, targets, initiatives, all of the
Yeah,
above?
I mean, I think we see, quite frankly, the places, if we look at the governments, for example, right, whether it is laws mandating equal representation in a parliament or some other, ruling body, whether it has been California making rules about women on boards. Salesforce, as a company specifically, made a rule about having women in meetings because they were realizing sort of that that broken rung that's spoken of, right? There might be a lot of equity or equitable access at sort of a junior level, but then you have this broken rung that McKinsey and Lean just found even continues to persist in their most recent data of getting into director and up from there. And so, there are these things. I think generally institutions kind of revert to inaction unless forced into the contrary, right? We sort of gravitate toward an inertia that works if it's working, or it seems to be kind of working. And so being jolted into action through policies, regulations, again, whether they're government or within the company, are absolutely critical. We've seen it with also laws, for example, in the US, where you can't ask for what they're making today, right? What their salary is, because that disproportionately affected women and people of color in their next job. Well, you were only making X amount, so we're not going to pay you much more than that. Those things matter. We see how materially those are impacting people and having a result. So I think it's great to say that, well, we don't need rules, we've got good people and all of that. And that's rarely enough to get the job done unless there is some sort of forcing mechanism. Again, whether that's demanding a certain amount of representation or proportionality, and certain other kind of rules and policies. And all of that together is what will move the needle and move things forward at a broader scale, again, versus just the one-offs that are great and easy to tout, but don't necessarily make for really systemic change.
Yeah. And you touched upon pay transparency a little bit there, because you mentioned to us that you believe that pay transparency is a catalyst for equality in the workplace. Could you delve a little bit more into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're seeing this pretty widely now, is that you need a level of accountability around pay. And it's, if not forced to pay someone more, most companies will not. So, and I don't think there's not necessarily, if you think about it from the perspective of like fiduciary responsibility, you can kind of see why that might be. If you can get two great people and one is 50,000 cheaper than the other, and you feel like they're equally good, morally, you should say, well, we should pay them the same amount versus, but again, if you could save your company 50,000, then that's good too. So it's about the pay transparency creates, for me, kind of a floor and a ceiling. I think the large part of it is ranges that, based on, this particular role requiring this amount of competency or experience, whatever the variables might be, this is what you can expect to be paid. And I think there's still a very interesting discussion going on that will go on for a while longer now about geography, now that work from home and work remotely is bigger, should you be paying people less because they don't live in an urban center? I think this is a really interesting other discussion around pay and equity that will continue to play out. But as far as whether it's for women or, again, more inclusively, other underrepresented folks in the tech industry, pay transparency goes a long way toward creating the parameters around hiring that ensure a level of parity between employers. And I think this is particularly true at larger companies where you start to have different managers and different biases, right? You start to get a very disparate human element into it. And so that companies mandating those parameters from the top prevents a lot of the leakage of things that, or overpaying or underpaying, can often happen. And so that transparency is really critical.
Yeah, and I think as well, it's so important in terms of retaining staff and the feeling as well of, I've been at companies where they say it's a fireable offence to discuss wages amongst each other, and you think, because there's a red flag there, because obviously there is something going on. And I think some companies, you obviously, as you say, that they don't put the salary on the job spec, and then you interview and you tell them what you expect. And then I've got in jobs before and I thought, you know what, I feel that I must be completely underpaid compared to the last person that was in this role. And you start to sort of catch on that perhaps, the last editor that was there was paid a lot more than me, but nobody has pointed that out. Mm-hmm. And whereas actually when I got to She Can Code, I was blown away by the fact that when I asked for my salary and I met my boss and she said to me, you know what, you dithered on your salary. And I said, yes. And she said, we actually had a little bit more available for the role. And because that's something that we promote, we would like to give you that. And I was gobsmacked because I hadn't actually had a company say to me before, and to just be so transparent and honest about it. And that if that budget was there, then it's available for you, not thinking, actually we saved X amount of money because she didn't ask for it. And actually it gets you, when you start at a company, you think, even though I'm young, I'm going to retire at this company because it is, I've started off on a good footing, rather than other companies. I felt a bit like, well, that left a bad taste in my mouth and I've only just started here, So in terms of retention, especially in the tech sector, why wouldn't you be transparent about pay?
Yeah. And I think the big part of this, at least the way that we've thought about it, is, with ranges. So a role can be, you could be on the cusp of a promotion. And I believe very much in this too, is being really careful not to right or wrong size a role relative to someone just based on pay. So this also helps, right? If you are not a senior, a senior manager in terms of competence, but you're coming in with compensation demands that only match that pay band, then we have a really honest conversation, right? Either your expectations are unreasonable, at least for what we can pay for the role, or we'd love to start you as a manager and, kind of put you there. And I think it doesn't set anyone up for success to have that off balance. And if someone wants to be paid more and we think they are in fact a senior, they applied for a manager role, but their compensation, and they've blown us away in the interviews, we're not just going to pay them more at that title. We're going to pay them more at the next title. But if we don't think that they're actually at that title, we're also not going to hire them and have that wrong. So it's right sizing pay, but it's also right sizing leveling, because you don't want to set someone up to fail by virtue of putting them in a role that's too big or too small, right? In both cases, just based on the compensation. So I think it just sets everyone up to be met where they are in a more effective way and manage those expectations. Again, if you're in a manager role, just for the sake of argument, but that's your first manager role. So maybe you're going to be in it for 2 years versus someone who, it's a career change, but they actually have some interesting experience. Maybe they're going to get promoted in 6 months. So having a range that gets them closer, that's okay too. So it's good to have the flexibility to meet the business needs, but also to meet the candidate kind of where they are, and recognize that everyone's going to be bringing something a little bit different to a role, as long as it's within the important parameters of what the job actually requires you to do and that we're willing to pay for. It leads to a much more healthy discussion and right sizing that I think benefits all parties.
Yeah, yeah. I actually, it leads me on to my last question. I wanted to ask you about advice. You've already shared a lot of great advice with us already, but do you have any advice that our listeners would love to hear if they're about to enter the industry?
Yeah. The thing that I wish I had realized sooner in my career is that it's so much more satisfying and fulfilling, rewarding, fill in the blank, to earn the support and admiration of the people who either work for you or your peers directly around you than it is to try and win that from people at the top of the food chain. And I love the expression, a leader without followers is just out for a walk. And I think, but there's also an element of kind of celebrating alone when you're the only person at the top and you've sort of forgotten about that is sort of missing the point of why we do this. And as a very motivated, high achieving kind of type A type of person, I think I had just assumed all along that the highest mark of my success was the people above me telling me that I'm a success and that I did it. And I wish I had realized sooner that it's infinitely more gratifying to hear that and be around people and hear that from your team and the people that you work directly with, than from the people at the top. And that was a harder learned lesson that took longer than I would have liked. But just remembering that it is not just about rushing to the top and then looking around and realizing you made it, but you're there alone. You're much, much better off slowing down, bringing people along with you and celebrating together when you get there. And that means a lot to me to have learned that. And I just, again, wish I'd learned it a little bit sooner.
Yeah, and I hear that a lot about as well, that rushing ahead, because I think when people say, and they ask, well, where do you want to be in the next X amount of years? People always say, I want to be the CEO or, whatever it may be, but actually they forget about all of the positions in between that are going to get you there. And they're not always looking actually, what is that next step? Who is that role model in the next position that I need to be looking at? Not necessarily, the lady who is giving the keynote speak at the conference, who is incredibly inspirational, but actually what's my next move?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Cory. I'm sorry, but we are out of time. I could talk about this all afternoon. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to everybody listening, as usual, thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you again next time.